I haven't talked about bark beetles in a while, but it's kind of fun to go back and get involved in this topic. This is a photo of Yosemite Valley. I think this was 78 or 79. There was a big drought just before that. This is sort of at the end of the drought. And there was a lot of bark beetle mortality in the valley at that time. And the valley is a pretty a good place to see various pests, not just bark beetles. Yeah. And I did some of my graduate research here. I just wanted to, I'm just using this slide to tell you a little bit about my background. Actually, it's a picture I took. It appeared on a magazine cover. And this is a bark beetle. This is Jeffrey pine beetle. This picture was taken up near Lassen National Park. And it's a what's called a teneral adult. It's an adult that just finished its pupation and is about ready to emerge from the tree. And you can see that fungus growing around it. That bark beetles are associated with a lot of microorganisms, and I'll talk about that. When I was a graduate student, I went to UC Berkeley. I studied bark beetles, both for my master's degree and my PhD. I had to make this choice about going into research or going into what I would call extension. And I really did want to get an extension type of position, which with forest insects pretty much means either working for the US Forest Service or one of the state governments. So I actually ended up doing both. I started my career with the US Forest Service in New Mexico, and then I came to California, and then I switched to CAL FIRE. And so as a graduate student, I became very much involved with bark beetles in terms of research that I was doing. And then as a employee of the US Forest Service and CAL FIRE, I became more involved in just a variety of things, because if you're doing extension work, you're really helping landowners with a variety of problems. Bark beetles, of course, but I have a background in entomology and pathology and am familiar with all kinds of forest pests. There's a lot of different types of bark beetles, and I just want to show you some of the trees that have been attacked, either partially killed or killed by bark beetles, as well as a tree that has a disease. And bark beetles come in all different forms, and they're very tiny insects, and I'll talk about that and show you some pictures. But there's a lot of different bark beetles out there. The ones that are important to us are the ones that attack trees and kill them, or attack parts of trees and kill them. And this shows a tree with top dying back, which is from bark beetles. There's drought mortality. That tree that is fading in color has been killed by bark beetles. Bark beetles also can carry diseases and start that process of the tree becoming infected with the disease and then declining in health because of the disease, which is what this black stain is doing. Black stain is a native disease that is carried by bark beetles and introduced into the tree by bark beetles. It can't get into the tree otherwise. Bark beetles are the vector. This just shows you the life cycle of a beetle, and they go through a complete metamorphosis. So there's eggs, pupae, adults. The larvae are the ones that feed underneath the bark. The adults are the ones that move the population around and are the ones that attack trees. Like I said, bark beetles come in a lot of different forms. These are all bark beetles, and there's many different genera, but the most important genera in California in terms of causing tree mortality and damage are the ones shown here: Dendroctonus, Scolitis, and Ips. The green highlighted ones are Dendroctonus. Scolitis is surrounded by white, and the blue is Ips. And then this other one, Hylastes, is not a tree killer, but it is one that carries disease. It's one that carries that black stain root disease. So when the tree is attacked, I don't know how that ended up showing there, but when the tree is attacked, the beetles bore through the bark. They go to the cambium region, and the cambium of the tree is rich in nutrients, so it's a food source for the beetles. The adults bore into the bark. They go to that cambial region, and they lay their eggs there. They create what is called an adult gallery or tunnel. The beetles bore through the cambium, and then they lay their eggs along the edge of that adult tunnel, and the larvae bore out perpendicular to that. These are all larval tunnels, or feeding, shown there. And the one picture with the piece of wood dissected shows an old bark beetle attack that was unsuccessful. There were no larvae developed out of that attack, but it did kill a portion of the cambium, and that cambium became embedded in the wood as the tree grew. Just like any kind of wound, if you create a wound and you disrupt that cambium, there's a scar that will become embedded in the wood. So when beetles attack a tree, but they also attack other things besides a standing live tree. When they attack a tree, there's a couple reasons why they do this. We call it a mass attack. And that is because, for one thing, in many situations they're competing with other beetles for the same resource. And so you want to be the first one there, and you want to be the first one there, and you want to bring your buddies in, right? As opposed to other insects coming in and taking advantage of what in many cases is a limited resource. So the beetles, and I'll talk a little bit more about this soon, they communicate with each other via odors. And they can bring additional beetles in using pheromones. Also, in order to kill a live tree, you can't kill a live tree with just a few beetles. You have to have a mass attack. There has to be a large number of beetles attacking the tree at any one time in a very short period of time in order to kill it. Otherwise, the tree would survive. So when beetles are attracted to something that they're going to attack, there's a couple ways this attraction can occur. One way that attraction occurs is that the trees themselves produce chemicals that are attractive to the beetles. And so if you wound a tree, that tree is producing these chemicals, in this case just the odor of resin, and that can be attractive to a number of beetles to bring them into the tree, to know that that tree is wounded and is perhaps weakened and is therefore a good candidate for us to attack. The other form of communication that beetles use is called secondary attraction, and these secondary attractants are beetle-produced chemicals that the beetles use then to bring in additional beetles of the same species to colonize whatever it is that they're attacking, whether it be a standing tree or maybe even a recently cut down tree or a recently blown over tree or whatever. They use these chemicals to bring in additional beetles to more effectively colonize and that resource, or to more effectively kill the tree. And these chemicals also, these pheromones, are also attractive to natural enemies, which is the reason I put that there. Once the beetles begin to bore into the tree, close range communication is via sound. And so they actually communicate then back and forth with vibrations, with sound. A female, in the case of the beetle shown here, would attack the tree. She creates a tunnel. The male comes to join her, but she needs to know that that male is the same species as she is, and it's not a predator. And so they communicate with sound in order to signal that. So these beetles you know, they have eyesight, but they're not using eyesight all that much. They're much more likely to use, you know, odors and then close range sound. Something interesting about these pheromones is that they are extremely powerful. And these pheromones have been identified for quite a few beetles. And you can literally take these pheromones, put them on a tree, and kill the tree because it attracts beetles to that tree. And that's what happened here. There's also pheromones that are referred to as anti-attractants. So the whole process of colonizing whatever it is the beetles are colonizing is mediated by these odors. And there's attractants, but there's also odors that say, okay, the hotel is full. You know, we don't want any more beetles there. We don't want more competition. So there are chemicals that will repel beetles to some extent. So if they're attacking a live tree, they have to kill it in order to be able to successfully breed in the tree. They cannot attack a tree, or they have to kill a portion of the tree. They don't have to kill the entire tree, but they have to kill that portion of the tree that they're attacking. And the trees, of course, have evolved defense against the beetles. And these are all indicators that the tree is defending itself pretty effectively. With pine trees, and this is a fir, resin is a defensive chemical. And as the beetles bore in, they're met by this flood. If it's a healthy tree, has lots of water, they're met by this flood of resin that is produced by the tree. The tree literally tries to drown the beetles out. But resin is a toxic material, and it also hardens and can encase the beetles. Anyway, these are all signs that the trees are being attacked, but also that these trees are being successful at defending themselves. This situation changes, and lots of times you'll see a tree that's just being attacked initially and it's producing resin. You see these pitch tubes produced, you see the pitch being produced and coming out of the tree. But then as more and more beetles come, the defenses may be overcome, and you no longer get that pitch, but you get just this dry dust coming out of the holes that the beetles are creating as they go into the tree. And then as the beetles develop underneath the bark, the larvae develop underneath the bark, other things find them and try to eat them. Woodpeckers. And this is a tree killed by western pine beetle. This is very typical to have the woodpeckers completely strip the bark off the outer bark of those trees and try to find the larvae that are inside the tree. As far as we know, though, these woodpeckers are not an effective biological control for bark beetles. You know the tree's dead when it starts to change color. So it goes through these color changes. Initially, it'll become sort of a yellowish color, and then a brownish red color. And then you have exit holes of the adult beetles up at the top there that are leaving the tree. If you see a tree that's completely changed color, more than likely it's dead. If you see a tree that's changed color in part, and there's still some green in that tree, it may only have been partially killed, or maybe it's not even bark beetles that we're dealing with. It could be something else. So these beetles are little transports for all kinds of microorganisms. And you know, the question came up about how big are the beetles. They're only about the size of a grain of rice. That's sort of an average size. And the biggest one is less than a centimeter long. But when they leave the tree, they actually leave the tree with a lot of things attached to them. And one of the things that is attached to them is fungi. But there's also bacteria, yeast, which is a type of fungus. There's nematodes, there's mites. All kinds of things are on those beetles. And so when they fly off to another tree, they're taking with them this whole little micro microcosm of organisms that they introduce to the tree that they're attacking. And some of these fungi are pretty well known as consistent associates of the beetles. In other words, the beetles and the fungi have a very close association, and they're almost always carried by the beetles. And so some of these fungi, if you think about it in terms of evolution, some of these fungi have developed so that they are very good at being, so the beetle itself wants to be the first one in there to this fresh resource, but then the fungi also are in that competition mode. So there's a lot of fungi that are actually trying to compete to get into the wood. The fungi will colonize the bark, but also the wood. And you can think about it this way, that perhaps that's how these very aggressive pathogenic fungi developed, which beetles do carry. There's a lot of debate about, you know, how much do the beetles contribute to tree mortality versus the fungi. But we do know that some of these fungi are pathogenic, and they kill the sapwood and cause it to be non-conductive, so there's no conduction of water. This is an interesting picture. The very top up there, that's called blue stain, and these fungi, not all of them, but some of them, create a stain in the wood that looks like it's bluish gray. But they don't turn that color right away. They actually colonize the wood, and you don't see any discoloration right away. This is an experiment where these fungi were inoculated into the tree, and the white or the light colored areas there are actually where the fungus is. The blue is dyed water, and it shows you how they cut off the conduction of water in the tree. This is a disease. This is a black stain that's also carried by bark beetles. It's not a regular associate of bark beetles, but it is an important one, because if the bark beetles are carrying it, they can introduce it to a tree. This fungus does not kill trees outright, but it takes time. But once the tree is inoculated with it, it can spread quite a bit within the tree and eventually lead to it dying. The best way to describe, what beetles do, they're basically opportunistic. They're taking advantage of a resource out there that is in some way weakened, recently killed. They rarely kill live, healthy trees. They can if their populations are high enough, but they rarely kill live, healthy trees. So here's a situation with lodgepole pine where these are old trees growing very densely. They're under stress. This is a very good setup for bark beetle attack, where they would kill trees. Fire also can lead to bark beetle attacks. We typically don't see beetles extending beyond the borders of fires as a result of these beetles attacking the fire damaged trees, but fire damaged trees definitely are a target. Disease trees, and these are a couple. This is actually a Porterford cedar root disease, and right above it are bark beetle attacks. This is a gnosis root disease, a very common disease in our forest. And these are white firs that with a gnosis. These are also susceptible to bark beetle attack because the disease weakens them ahead of the beetles. I already mentioned wounding. Sometimes we do things that we don't know are going to produce a bad result, but this is wounding done by some deep tilling of a forest plantation, and what happened is the roots were wounded in this effort here, and that wounding actually attracted bark beetles into the area that killed the trees. This, I'm not quite sure how these trees were wounded at the top, but it could have been lightning. It could have also been just mortality from drought, but this is a red fir up in Shasta National Park, I think. And these big old trees quite often get killed in the tops Some of it could be lightning, some of it could be drought and beetles coming in. But either way, the beetles are what take out those tops ultimately. Also, we can cut fresh green material, in a thinning operation, or even, this is a road building operation over here, and it's a magnet for beetles. So that green material that was cut became colonized with beetles. And once the green material is colonized, the populations build up, and they can then spread to healthy live trees and kill them because their populations are up. This is a situation where we also had a thinning, and this is red turpentine beetle killed this tree. But red turpentine beetle was not getting into what we call slash, like is was shown here, but was getting into the stumps and the roots, and leaving that and killing trees. Okay. The big thing in California, though, with everybody associates bark beetles with is drought, right? So this is Lake Tahoe during drought. This is actually the Truckee River that flows into Lake Tahoe, totally dry, 1992. And then this other picture is me standing on the lake bed, which receded away from the shore during that year, so that these trees that were growing basically with their roots in the water virtually no longer had that, and were beginning to die along the shore of Lake Tahoe because they were drought stressed. Just a little bit about drought. This is a graph of the Palmer Drought Index. It's not a graph of precipitation, but it's an indicator of what kind of stress, drought stress, plants are under, including trees. Everything in blue is a wet year. Everything in red is a drought year, okay? So this shows a couple of things worth noting. One is that California has always been this way, at least as far as we know, and much of the West, where you get this fluctuation between drought and excess precipitation, right? And so you see a lot of variation in terms of the amount of precipitation that California gets. And this is actually a west-wide phenomenon, pretty much. But California is pretty extreme. And the other thing to note with this is that the red, as we go forward, is getting worse. We're having more droughts, and the idea then is that this is probably, most likely, a result of global warming. And in the future, is it going to get even worse than this? We've seen some really bad droughts in recent years. Bark beetles sort of came to everybody's attention, the public's attention, because of some pretty spectacular mortality that occurred as a result of bark beetles in the western United States. And the most famous beetle, I guess, is this mountain pine beetle, because it has a very broad distribution across the western United States. And it kills a variety of pine trees. I think this is a lodgepole pine here. And these outbreaks of the mountain pine beetle have been around for a long time, but we're seeing them now in areas where they didn't exist before, and we're also seeing them on a broader scale in some cases. But this is an indicator too of what is happening with global warming and increasing drought. So this just shows you some things related to the mountain pine beetle. And one thing I wanted to point out is that, so this is lodgepole pine, and we don't have we have a lot of lodgepole pine in California, but it's not utilized all that much as a wood product in California. But if you go to other parts of the West, it is. And there are some pretty, have been some pretty extreme outbreaks of the mountain pine beetle in western states. And what we are finding is, or what we knew from studying this beetle early on, is that it has a very close relationship with lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine is a short-lived tree. I mean, once you start hitting around 80 to 100 years old, that's considered to be an old lodgepole pine. And these stands of lodgepole pine would become decadent, and the beetles would come in and kill them, and then we would have fire. So there is a pretty well documented through historic times of these outbreaks from the mountain pine beetle in lodgepole pine, where this is a natural outcome of reoccurring drought, but also, even more so, just the fact that these trees are, this is the way they are designed to live. They live for a short period of time. I mean, 100 years, we have a lot of trees that live beyond 100 years. Lodgepole pines can too, but they become decadent in their final years as they approach 100. And once they become decadent, they become bark beetle susceptible. The beetles can kill these stands of trees. And then if a fire comes through, lodgepole pine is a tree species that reproduces best under fire conditions. So you will get stands that come back very thick and uniform in age, and the cycle just repeats itself. Okay. The thing with global warming, this mountain pine beetle is actually becoming more of a problem in areas where we did not see it before. Higher elevation pines may be attacked by it, and some of the high elevation pines are very restricted in terms of their ranges. So there is certainly concern about these trees in the western United States. White bark pine, for example, is one that is being attacked and killed in areas where it wasn't killed before. Warmer temperatures enable the beetle to complete their life cycle quicker, and it enables outbreaks to be more successful, is the basic message here. Western pine beetle, this is probably our most important bark beetle in California. It's the one we hear about. It's the killer of ponderosa pine. It also attacks coulter pine. It prefers trees in an endemic situation where it's not in an outbreak. It would prefer trees that are over mature and stressed just by age. It would prefer trees in dense stands. It would be able to reproduce in many wildfire-killed trees. But then, of course, it also is related to drought stress and disease. And it is the most serious bark beetle in terms of our timber resource, because we utilize a lot of ponderosa pine, harvesting it in California. I want to mention this beetle because this is a beetle that I studied as a graduate student, and it's not particularly a serious beetle in the sense that it can kill trees. It does occasionally kill trees under unusual situations, but it's nothing like the western pine beetle or the mountain pine beetle. But this beetle, the red turpentine beetle, which you see signs of here, it usually attacks the base of a tree and the roots, larger roots, was accidentally introduced to China. And it was introduced on logs that still had bark intact. And because it was introduced to China, it had a new environment. And as an invasive pest, it became one of China's most serious forest pests. and which is an interesting situation to us here because we don't consider it to be that bad of a bark beetle. But a lot of the research that's been done on this beetle most recently, I worked on it a long, long time ago. I also did some work with the Chinese, but most of the research done on this beetle now has been done by the Chinese, even though it's our bark beetle. True furs like white fur, red fur are attacked by the scolitis. This is an interesting beetle because it's very closely related to drought and disease. It typically attacks in endemic situations, you know, old trees, diseased trees, but when we have a drought, the populations can just explode. Probably more so than many other beetle populations. There have been, on the drier fur sites, and I'll show you what I mean by a drier fur site, we can have extreme mortality from this beetle. They develop during drought. The trees are stressed. They can't defend themselves. They're killed by the beetles. But as soon as the drought turns around, these populations collapse very quickly. It's not a very aggressive beetle, but if the tree is stressed enough, it will kill them, and can kill them in a big way. So if you look at these two yellow lines, the area encompassed within those two lines is actually pretty good rainfall, some of our better forests. This would be pretty much the west side of the Sierras and the Cascades, where it's wetter. You go over to the east side of the Sierras and the Cascades, and you start to fall off in terms of precipitation, and it gets much drier. So everything to this side of that yellow line is northeastern California, and that's where we see a lot of this true fir mortality because of drought. The trees may be able to get started, they may be able to grow well, but with drought, if you don't have enough precipitation, and then let's say you cut it in half, the fir trees are left pretty much defenseless. So this just illustrates where you would find the mortality, a great deal of it occurring in northeastern California. These droughts are interesting because when they occur, the beetles start attacking the trees pretty aggressively. But as the drought comes to an end, you can still have good beetle populations, but the trees are defending themselves better. And this is why we get these scars where the tree has successfully defended itself against the beetles, but the beetles so the beetles are not reproducing anymore, and the population collapses. But these scars embedded in the wood are a common feature of a lot of trees in these areas that are drought stressed. And you can use the scars to date when droughts occur. So let's talk a little bit about beetle management. And so, you know, in the olden days, and even somewhat today, you know, it's kill the insect, right? And there were some big projects where they tried to eliminate bark beetles by felling trees, peeling off the bark, and burning it. And they were largely unsuccessful. It's pretty tough to do that kind of control when the trees are already under stress. And you're just trying to eliminate these huge populations of beetles. You know, I mean, what we concentrate more on today is creating healthy stands. So you can thin stands to reduce competition between trees, and you can remove high-risk trees, which, and you know, if you look at these two trees, this one on the right is one that has received. These are white firs. This is one that has received a lot of attacks from the scolitis in the past. It actually shows a lot of evidence of crown dieback because of that beetle. You would remove that tree, maybe keep the other one, which has a much healthier crown. High-value trees can be protected from beetles. There are chemicals you can spray on the bark. It's a pretty nasty process, but it can be done if the tree is valuable enough. I also mentioned these anti-attractants, and the anti-attractants can also be used in certain situations to repel beetles from individual trees, keep them away from individual trees, or maybe even a small group of trees. But we've never been successful at preventing beetle attack using these anti-attractants over large areas. There's been some experiments where they've tried to do that, but there's never been any success over large areas. But there are actually formulations that are available. You have to be a certified pest applicator, licensed applicator in order to use them. But there are chemicals available. And this is much better than spraying the entire tree with a pesticide. You just have these little packets that you can put on a tree, and they act as a repellent, or at least a message to the beetle to stay away. I just want to mention that there's a whole bunch of things that get into bark and wood, and I'm not going to talk about these, but I want to mention them because they can be damaging pretty much in a way, some of them, that is similar to bark beetles. And this is one of them, the fur flat-headed borer. This is our most serious pest of Douglas fir under drought stress. There is a Douglas fir beetle, but this insect is more important in terms of drought-stressed Douglas fir. Kills it in our area here and throughout California, wherever Douglas fir might be under stress. And I just want to give you this message because this is an important issue. And you may have seen these in some of the Caltrans rest stop areas. Don't move firewood. Firewood can contain insects and diseases that if you move it to some place where it doesn't exist, can cause problems. And the gold-spotted oak borer, which is a pest in Southern California, most likely got there through firewood. The interesting thing about that is it's a native insect to the United States, but it's not native to California. And when it was introduced to Southern California, it started killing oak trees. And so, you know, this campaign, it makes a lot of sense because there's many insects and diseases that potentially could be moved by firewood. Using firewood locally or sourced locally is fine. But if you transport it long distances, you may be taking something into an area where it doesn't already exist. You know, some very serious pests back east, the Asian longhorn beetle and the emerald ash borer are transported with firewood. So I just want to talk about what is a pest, and this is a very simple diagram that if you take any sort of pest management course, you know, this is going to be like the basic thing that they're going to tell you right off the bat. A lot of our control efforts are aimed just at the pest, but in terms of understanding whether or not you're going to be effective, you have to consider everything. So the host condition, the environment that is impacting both the pest and the host. I've dealt with a lot of landowners, and I was always amazed at how many people think you can just go out there, insects, and solve a problem. And this is why you can't, because you're dealing with something more complex. You're dealing with the environment, you're dealing with the host. You can get rid of the pest maybe for a short period of time, but you may be not able to solve the problem. And these pictures are just sort of interesting historical things. The top picture is actually a modern day picture, but this is burning the mountain pine beetle in effigy. And So it's somewhat of a party, but it's also somewhat serious because they really hate the mountain pine beetle where this occurs, because it's killed a lot of trees in the forests around them. This is South Dakota. And of course, this is an old picture. This is burning up mountain pine beetle. You douse a tree with diesel or something, and then you light it on fire. So let's just talk a little bit about the host condition. And this is a map that's quite interesting. You know, foresters have known for a long time that if you collect seed and you plant it, you want to plant it as close to its source as possible. The further you go away when you plant seed from a tree, the more likely you are to have problems. And so these seed zones exist. Ideally, if you collect seed here, you want to plant it within here. You can get away with planting it around the edges, but the further you go away, the less likely you're going to get away with that being a healthy tree as it grows up. So foresters have known this for a long time, and insects and diseases play an important role in this. They take advantage of trees that are planted off-site, you know, trees that are growing someplace where they don't belong. And it's an interesting concept because a lot of folks would think, oh, well, it's a ponderosa pine, you can plant it wherever you want to. It doesn't work that way, at least not in the forest. I concentrated on bark beetles. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to explore this idea of a pest. And when I talked to David, I originally said, you know, I'd like to talk about this. And he said, oh, no, you got to talk about bark beetles. But I'm going to talk about this because I still have some time. But this is so the bark beetles, you can think of them as one of our worst pests. You can think of this as a sometimes pest, but not really a very serious one. And it's a native insect. And the reason I was fascinated with it is because when I started working for CAL FIRE back in the late 80s, this was one of the first things I saw. And when I saw it, I talked to some of my colleagues and they said they didn't know what it was. And it's actually a very obscure pest. It's also a very, it's not well known, but it's also very hard to find evidence of it. And so I encountered it and wasn't even sure when I encountered it if what I was seeing was really damage from it. But I eventually came to the conclusion it was, and I'll just explain that a little bit. So I began working for CAL FIRE back in the late 80s, and one of the first things I saw was this occurring in the community of gray eagle. This is branch dieback, and I sent the material collected from these branches to an expert with Food and Ag in Sacramento. His name was Ray Gill, and he was a scale expert. And he said, oh yeah, there's evidence of the scale on these branches that are dying. Well, he's not a pest expert. He's a taxonomic person. He's good at identifying things, but he said, well, I don't know if it's a pest or not. I don't know if this is what's causing the damage. But if you look at the literature, there is a good bit of study was done by this McKenzie person on this particular insect, but a long time ago. And the interesting thing is, when I looked at it, one of the things I did was look for evidence of this pest being reported in what we call the annual conditions report, which is a compilation of all the pests that have caused some damage in California for a particular year on forest trees. I couldn't find this pest anywhere in these conditions reports. So obviously it's not a very commonly reported thing. That doesn't mean it's not out there, because it is. But anyway, so the first time I saw it, I said, okay, yeah, that's it. And the other thing that's really hard to confirm with this pest is it's difficult to find. When you start seeing this dieback, it usually occurs in the early summer, late spring, early summer. And by the time that occurs, people ask you to go look at the trees, and the insect is almost impossible to find, just because of the life cycle, which is fairly complex. Anyway, that outbreak declined, and I was able to find another report about this insect, but it had nothing to do with it being a pest. It actually had to do with it being a source of food for birds. And Don Dawson, who wrote this report, was someone I worked for when I was a graduate student. And I had never heard of this insect, and it's not one that they taught us anything about. But he had an interest in birds and what they ate. And this was the most common insect found in chickadees that were out in the woods during the winter. And they would chip off the bark and feed on the insect underneath. So it was kind of a fascinating situation there, because you go out in the woods and you'd see these tops of trees where the bark had been chipped off, and you think, I wonder what's causing that. Well, it's chickadees going after this insect. Don't read this. Just know that once I recognized it, I started reporting it in the conditions report. And so, I realized that there are quite a few incidences where this damage can be found. And there's a characteristic among all these different situations. There are trees that are either planted off-site, or they are trees that are on the margin of where they should be growing. In other words, they're under stress because they're not in an ideal environment. So this insect can become a problem in situations where the trees really don't quite belong there, and the trees can't defend themselves that well from this particular insect. But I still was having a hard time finding the insect. You could find evidence of the insect, but finding a live insect was a big challenge for me until 2009, when somebody sent me a whole bunch of samples that had live insects on them. And this was in February, which is when I never looked for this insect before. And it turns out this was a seed orchard where all the trees were taken good care of, but they were all planted off-site. They're planted in a really dry location, but they were irrigated. The trees were doing fine, but they were so heavily infested with the scale you couldn't believe it. And this guy sent me a bunch of branches, and I thought, whoa, here's the scale that I've been looking for. Here's the live insects that I've been looking for. This is another outbreak that did occur that was very similar to the one in gray eagle. You can see the dying branches. But the point I want to make with this is that this is basically an obligate parasite. The scale does not want to kill the branch. If it kills the branch, it kills itself, because it lives on that branch for a good part of the year. These branches would die, and the scales would die. So it's really sort of a perversion that this occurs. But it does occur. And the best I can explain it is to say that it's a hypersensitive reaction from the tree. And the trees basically overdo it when they're trying to defend themselves from the scale. There's some symptoms. You get these rough areas in the bark. I'll explain the life cycle, and hopefully I can do it well enough that you'll understand what's going on here. But it has a fairly complicated life cycle. It feeds on the inner bark, and it works its way into little cracks and crevices, and it puts down a feeding tube, so to speak, mouth parts that go into the bark, and then it draws its nutrients from the living bark. In doing so, it's totally motionless. It just sits there and feeds. It does nothing else other than that. The tree, meanwhile, is growing around it, and some of these scales totally get encapsulated within the bark. But one thing for sure is they're not easy to see because they're always down in these little cracks and crevices, and you have to take apart the bark to find them. And when they come to the point where they're ready to emerge, some of them don't emerge because they've simply been crushed or enveloped by the bark. My guess is that if you have stress on the trees, maybe drought, you have less growth, the bark is not likely to kill the insect as readily as if it's a very healthy tree that's getting a lot of water and is growing rapidly. Anyway, so you have these different stages of the insect. This is the feeding stage, so to speak. It's called a cyst. And it just looks like a little round thing. I'll show you pictures of it. And then there are adults that emerge, depending on the elevation, probably in the wintertime sometime, but late winter or early spring. And they mate and they go out, and the female basically turns into a big egg sac, and the eggs are hatched, and you get these little crawlers that come out, crawlers of scales. They are the dispersal stage, and they're little insects. They find a place to settle down, and then they turn into this cyst. But the interesting thing too about this is the males and females look totally different. So this is an empty cyst, and if you look at these trees with the dying branches in the early summer, late spring, early summer, this is about all you find, these empty cysts. The crawlers are so small, you're not going to find them. You can find the eggs sometimes, but not always, depending on where the insect is in its development. So I got these samples from Oregon. I had these insects in my office, and I was able to watch them and photograph them. And this is a female emerging from one of these cysts. So the cyst itself is embedded in the bark, but a portion of it is free, and I'll just go through this real fast. They break through the surface, and they have to squeeze out of these things. And sometimes they don't make it. And when they come out, this is what they look like, little blobs with antennae. And the females don't move very much. They just get out there, and then they're on the bark, and they take a position, and they raise their abdomen and wait for a male to come mate with them. And this is what the cocoons look like. Females do not form a cocoon. They go through what you would really consider to be an incomplete metamorphosis. There's not this dramatic change from the immature to the mature. But with the males, there's a very drastic change in appearance of these insects. So they get through a pupal stage, and these are the cocoons. And this is what the males look like. And I was amazed when I saw them mating in my office.
Big mama.
Yeah. And I mentioned this at a meeting to a scale specialist, and he said, "You may be the only person who's ever seen this." So it was kind of exciting for me. Okay. Yeah. The females are just a big bag of eggs. They once they're mated, they end up dying and shriveling up, and the eggs become exposed, and then you have the crawlers, and the whole cycle starts over again. So anyway, I don't really need to go into this too much. I don't consider them that much of a pest, but they can cause damage. Most of it is on drier sites and in areas where other scales may be active. Scales take advantage of these trees that are stressed, and off-site plantings. Some outbreaks are significant enough, but it's not a long-lived. It's not a long-lived type of outbreak or one that typically kills trees. It may damage the trees in the short term, but trees usually recover. And on some of the really bad sites, some of the weird-looking trees that you see, and with a lot of apparent crown dieback and roughened bark and things like that potentially could be due to this scale. An interesting thing about a relative of this scale is that it is a serious pest back east. So a Matsacoccus scale, which is what this is, was introduced from China to the eastern coast of the US. And the Matsacoccus scale initially was identified as a native insect. And they didn't know that it was an introduced insect. And it took a long time for them to figure this out. But it started killing ornamental trees back east, and also red pine, which is a native tree. But it was bad on red pine planted off-site. Red pine that grew in native stands where it was supposed to be growing were not really impacted by this scale. But off-site plantings were. And unfortunately, they had done a lot of planting of red pine off-site because it's a fast-growing tree, and they really were trying to get trees on some landscapes and planted a lot of this tree. Anyway, I just wanted to make this point. Things that are put into a new environment can become a problem. And of course, innocuous insects like this, that maybe are not considered really to be a problem, could potentially be a problem if they're moved somewhere else where they don't belong. They become invasive. I think that's an important point. Just a little footnote to this whole story about this insect, and I am going to be finishing up pretty soon. This insect is so obscure, and I read that it attacks a number of different types of pines. And I said, okay, well, I wonder if it attacked, well, I did know, the literature said that you could find it on foothill pine. Well, I've got a lot of foothill pine on my property. So I went out and I started peeling off bark on trees for about 2 hours. And I found maybe 5 scales of this scale. So this insect, which had been hiding from me for, decades, there it was in my backyard as a perfectly innocuous insect, right? Okay. Feeding a chickadee. Because I mentioned climate quite a bit, I just had some closing things to say about climate, and I'm just going to sort of touch upon each one of these little points. But the effect of climate is both direct and indirect. For example, direct would be warming temperatures, insect life cycles becoming longer and more devastating in terms of pests being able to attack trees. Indirect would potentially be something like, trees being under stress because of drought. Environment is really the issue here, and climate would be considered part of that. And environment is what moderates this host insect or host pest interaction. The problem with this interaction, though, is that if the environment changes, if global warming gets worse, things have to adapt. The environment that they're living in is no longer optimal, perhaps. And so insects have a much better ability to adapt than trees do, right? So trees are in a bit of a tough spot, because if it was a slow change, trees can take advantage of that and go through evolutional changes. But if it's a really fast change, like climate change is happening right now, the trees are kind of in a tough spot. In terms of pests, we assume that new things are going to happen. We also probably assume that some native pests, even though they're not considered to be very serious, may become worse. California is a huge state, so we're not going to see things happening uniformly across the state. It's going to be a whole suite of different effects. The big thing is, we should anticipate change, and forests are going to be threatened because of that change. And so we should anticipate it and recognize that we may not be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. There's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty. So in terms of managing our forests and managing our pests, we have to think outside the box and be adaptable. The biggest impact in California, of course, that we're seeing currently and probably will see in the future is this effect of drought and fire and insects, which a good bit of this talk has concentrated on. So, I mean, if I had to say, what's going to be the biggest impact on our forests, it's going to be drought, fire, and insects. And it's probably going to be more of it, as we are seeing, than we have traditionally seen in the past. So that's it.